Hello and welcome everyone to our exploration of the Exalted Treatise on the response of the Tao. Today we continue the exploration of this particular line, which states, be faithful, filial, friendly, and fraternal. But what's really interesting and special about this line is that every word, as it's made up of 4 Chinese words, and every word predominantly denotes a relationship that we have in our lives. So in terms of being faithful, this is a certain moral obligation that we have towards others outside the home, in the community. And representative of these community relationships is the, you could say, the interactions that we have between our employer and employee, or simply leader and team member. So that's this idea of being faithful. Filiality, again, predominantly relates to the parent-child relationship, but as we've explained, also has a very extensive scope. Last week, Kelly explained about the notion of being friendly, so how older siblings interact with their younger siblings. And today, I'd like to talk about this notion of being fraternal, or fraternity, in Chinese pronounced as ti, which is how a younger sibling interacts with their older sibling. So, this sibling relationship is quite important, which is probably the main reason why we spent a bit of time on it. And it's not only important if we ourselves are siblings, but if we are raising siblings, if we have children or will have children in the future, if we are interacting with those who are siblings, it's important. It helps us to understand their psychology if we know where they are in the birth order and how they might be thinking. So what's the main difference between the ideas behind the older sibling and the younger sibling? Now, notice I haven't mentioned the middle sibling, because of course they can be they have responsibilities as the older sibling and as the younger sibling. So they have very special responsibilities. So we start with, like Kelly yesterday, looking at the etymology of these characters. So from the form of the Chinese characters themselves. For friendliness, the original or the small seal script of the character was really 2 hands. And the older sibling then has to think of the younger sibling as, their left and right arm. And this is interesting because for the older sibling, when they're born, they may not necessarily have younger siblings yet. And so oftentimes if we're more skilled, more experienced, we're stronger, we tend to leave others behind. And this happens particularly when we're young. It's easy to exclude or leave behind our younger siblings. And so therefore, friendliness denotes the idea that the older sibling has to think of their younger sibling as part of themselves, and then therefore they won't leave them out. Now, fraternity then is different, because the younger sibling, when they're born, they may have 1 or more older siblings already. And so being fraternal, if we look at this character, tells us how we might think. So on the left here is the small seal script of the Chinese character, which was how it was written 2,000 years ago. And this, we often refer to the small seal script because it's sort of more pictorial in nature, and it helps us think more about how the character was formed and what it means. And as you can see, it's almost a rough sketch of what is depicted in the photo here. And in the photo, you'll notice that it's a rope. And in order to create that knot, it's got these sort of sequential rings that the rope makes. So, in fact, if you've ever tied a knot, there's a certain sequence. And the sort of rings and, where you place the rope under certain parts all have or necessary. They have to come in order. And so therefore, this character originally meant order, which is, if you look at the left-hand side and the very bottom left, that is currently the character we use for order. When we say, first, second, third, we use this particular character, pronounced as D. And the character is on the left is how we write it now. So what happened to the original character? Well, that ultimately became used for the notion of the younger brother or younger sibling in general. And that's what it's used for today. And for fraternity, this concept is on the right bottom-hand side is how we write it now. You'll see it's composed of two parts, a left and a right. On the left part is actually the character for heart, the heart radical. Any word, you'll notice, any word that's to do with an attitude or a feeling often has this heart radical, whether it's at the bottom or on the left. And so fraternity is, if you put those two parts together, fraternity then is the notion of having an attitude, having a sort of mindfulness of this order and where we are within the family in terms of how we relate to our other siblings, our older siblings. So fraternity is this idea of affection between siblings, and specifically in terms of the treatise here, it's this idea of how younger siblings relate to older siblings, and always being mindful of the fact that you are maybe younger than others, and the need to respect others, mindfulness and respectfulness. This concept was very important in terms of family education and even traditional education. And we know this just by taking a quick glance through children's literature at the time, so in Imperial China. So some of you may have heard of a very famous children's textbook called the Three-Character Classic. And this was a textbook that was used by children. It was the very first book that a child would read for about the last 600 years of Imperial China. So very, very popular. It was used to develop and acquire literacy. And it's called the Three-Character Classic because, as you can see on the left-hand page, the phrases or the sentences are composed of 3 characters. Now, the page that I've extracted and the line that I want to refer to here is on the top and states Rong, aged 4, left the larger pairs. So Rong refers to Kong Rong, who is depicted here in this portrait. Obviously, he's not 4 years old in this picture. He was actually a very famous scholar official in around the 2nd century. And it was a period of time in China known as the Eastern Han period. Now, he was not only famous for his scholarship and his political activities, but also because he was the 20th generation descendant of Confucius. So as you can see, his last name is Kong. So he's a descendant of Confucius. But this particular anecdote relates to when he was just 4. So this is very famous anecdote, so much so that it's actually depicted in this painting that's now hung in the Summer Palace in Beijing. So what was it about? What happened? Well, apparently when Kong Rong was only aged 4, one day a guest dropped by and gifted the family with a basket of pears. Now, Kong Rong was the first on the scene, and he was asked to, choose one of the pears for himself. He chose the smallest pear. Why? Well, his father was curious as well, and Kong Rong replied that he was one of the younger siblings. He was the second youngest out of 6 siblings. And he chose one of the smallest pairs because he wanted to leave the larger pairs for his older siblings. So you can see even from the age of 4, he had this sort of consideration for those who were older than him. And you can imagine that his older siblings probably would have been involved in much more work around the house, would have been helping more, and doing more work. They're more deserving of the larger peers. This was probably what he was thinking in his mind, and certainly even at this young age, he had this affection and love for his brothers. A lesser known anecdote of Kongrong occurs when he's 16. It's not recorded in the 3-character classic, but it is recorded in the historical accounts. It talks about how at that time, China had quite severe sort of civil unrest. And that was because the court eunuchs were trying to take over the imperial government, and they were trying to oust their political opponents. Unfortunately, there was a man by the name of Zhang Jian, who was one of these, became a political fugitive because of this. And he was actually a friend of Kongrong's brother, who was named Kong Bao. And Zhang Jian, he actually sought refuge in the Kong family house. Now, on that day, Kong Bao, so his friend, was not actually at home. It was Kongrong who opened the door, saw that it was his brother's friend, and let him in. Fortunately, this friend was saved, and he later fled to another part of the country. But unfortunately for the Kong brothers, Kongrong and Kong Bao, they were arrested. They were arrested for being accessories to a political fugitive. This was a crime punishable by execution. So the 2 brothers were brought before the district magistrate, and the magistrate asked, who was responsible for harboring the fugitive. Kongrong, of course, confessed. He said, it was me, I let him in. But Kong Bao, his older brother, was very worried that Kongrong would be punished. And so he himself confessed that this was actually his friend, so he should be the one being punished. The 2 brothers were arguing, each trying to protect each other from taking the fall for this. And for some time, they were trying to convince the magistrate that each one trying to convince the magistrate that they should be the one taking the fall. The district magistrate couldn't decide, and so he deferred to the imperial court, who later ruled that the elder sibling should receive the punishment. But you can already see that Kongrong, this family feeling, this wanting to protect his siblings, was not something that he only felt at the age of 4, but was something that he was famous for throughout his life. So Kongrong presents to us a very famous historical figure for embodying this important virtue. Now, and that's the whole reason why for 600 years, children would read about his story. And from this very simple action, as it states here, he left the larger pairs. You can see that he was trying to be selfless, was not thinking about himself, but rather his siblings. And that very much encapsulates the essence of fraternity. There are other very famous stories. I'd like to share another one with you. It's about 3 siblings now. And this comes from the Treasury of Elementary Learning, but it's also documented in the historical texts. These 3 siblings lived also in the Han Dynasty, so around 2,000 years ago, and they were part of the Tian family. Now, what happened was, as they grew up, they sort of grew apart. They had their own families, but as at that time, these families would live together in sort of quite large estates. But the relationship between these siblings deteriorated to such an extent that they no longer wanted to live together. They decided to completely divide the property. So all the assets, the funds, and even, as it states here, the black wattle tree in their backyard, in their courtyard. So they wanted to divide that too. Maybe it had some memories. I'm sure the siblings sort of played under this tree in their childhood. So they wanted to make sure they each had a part of this tree. Now, having decided this, it was already quite late in the day, and they said, well, let's physically start dividing everything the following day. But when they woke up the following morning, they discovered that this tree, the black wattle tree, had in fact completely withered. And they were completely shocked that, this really sort of moved them to reflect on themselves, to reflect on the very sorry state of affairs, as well as the very sorry state of the tree. And they realized at that point that they were wrong, that, there are some things in life that are very special, they're very important to maintain, and particularly this brotherly bond, the bond that we have with our siblings. And so in that moment, they decided not to live apart. Miraculously, this tree came back to life and became healthy again. So this story moves us on various levels, both on a literal and figurative level. We get the sense that, the brothers are really part of one entity. And this alludes to a very important metaphor in traditional Chinese texts that you might read about siblings and about the family. So the metaphor that's used is the tree. So the tree is a metaphor for the family. How's that the case? Well, the roots of the tree, the most important part of the tree, represent the parents. So just like how the tree grows from its roots and is nourished through its roots, the family is created or developed and nourished through the parents, the care, the love, and attention of the parents. And children are reminded to be mindful of their roots, which is really to say to be mindful of the care, the love of their parents throughout their lives and the sacrifices their parents have made. Now, what about the sibling relationship? Well, the children in this tree metaphor relate to all the other parts of the tree. So the trunk, the branches, the flowers, fruits, etc. And if you think about it, the sort of parts of the tree and how the tree develops really sort of parallels the child's development, how they mature, how they blossom, thrive, flourish, and then ultimately have these fruits which then contribute to the community. Now, in terms of the sibling relationship, it's often said that siblings are sort of like the branches on the same tree. They share the same roots, same parents, and therefore they should see each other as one entity. So in another commonly used children's textbook called the 1,000-Character Essay, there's this particular line which states, "Let siblings fondly cherished be as branches of the same tree," because the siblings shared the same so-called same spirit, and you could say from a scientific point of view, the same genes as their parents. So this is a very important analogy that is used. Another kind of pictorial representation of the sibling relationship is that of geese, so wild geese and their flying formation. So anyone who has ever watched these sort of nature documentaries will know that migratory birds, they often form this V shape when they're flying, migrating between the two poles. And in particular, the geese were noted by the ancient Chinese. And there's this particular line in one of the 5 classics, Confucian classics, called the Records of Ritual. And it states that, how to behave towards someone who is around the same age as our older sibling is to, follow them in terms of, walking behind them as geese fly after one another in a row. So it was believed that these geese, when they were in the V formation, the older, the more experienced goose would be at the front of the V, and the rest would be in order of their seniority. And, if there was a much younger or weaker bird that sort of lost its way and fell behind, then the more experienced geese would, try to tend to this bird and bring it back into the fold. So there's this notion, of course, when we think about this flying V, today it's often used in talking about teamwork and how, the different members of that team sort of work together. We know, of course, that the flying V shape also helps with aerodynamics, helps them fly faster. And, they take turns being at the front of the V. And, this idea that from the, very early stages of Chinese history as recorded here, the idea that, siblings for us are our first experience of being in a team. We work together with others, just like in what they saw in nature. So again, a very powerful analogy. The idea and the sort of notion of fraternity was so important that, as you can see, it was emphasized in children's literature, but also even in family teaching, so family education. We've all heard of Liao Fan's 4 lessons, which are, in fact, the instructions that Liao Fan left towards his children and grandchildren, etc. But you could say the earliest surviving work of this genre of family instructions in Chinese history is that of the what's called the family instructions for the Yan clan. And this was written by Yan Zhitui in the 6th century. So this is one of the earliest extant works. It's quite long. It's about 20 chapters, and it includes everything from, how to teach your children, manners, importance of education, studying, phonology, etc. And the 2nd chapter is about siblings, interestingly enough. This was actually translated into English very early on in the 1960s. And this is the version that we'll be using today. And I've also made a few modifications. I've taken a few extracts from the 2nd chapter about siblings because it sort of helps us understand what was the Chinese perspective on siblings and why that was the case. So let's take a look at that now. Yan Zhitui begins this chapter by setting this sibling relationship within the other relationships that we have in the family. So he says that humanity, in all our human relationships, the foremost relationship is that of between spouses, because it's when we have spouses, when you have a partner, that they can create a family, and that's when you give rise to the parent-child relationship. If you have more than one child, then that gives rise to the sibling relationship, and here it states the fraternal relationship. So that's where it all comes from. If you think about it, the 3 relationships here, the between spouses, parent-child, between siblings, in the nuclear family, is actually the very core of all the different types of families you can think of, even, very somewhat complicated modern families today. But if you boil them down, it's really these 3 relationships. And so it says here that the closeness of the family is based on none other than these three relationships. But then the next sentence is interesting because it says all the various degrees of kinship. Now, in sort of traditional thought, there were sort of 9 degrees of kinship, from our great-great-grandfather down to our great-great-grandchildren and all the different generations. But also that's, thinking about it in terms of the generations, but also if you think about it in terms of cousins, aunties, uncles, etc., then you'll see that in the extended family there are various types of kinship relationships. Yenju Tui here is saying that all of the different degrees are derived from these 3. How? Well, if you think about it, the sort of relationship that we have with our aunts and uncles who are around the same age as our parents, we would sort of view them and care for them as if our parents when we're in their company. And similarly, when we're with our cousins, whether they're first degree, second degree cousins, then you would also think of them as if you're older or younger siblings. So therefore, these different relationships derived from the nuclear family will help us think about relationships in the extended families. And so he concludes this first paragraph by saying that, if we really want to know how to interact in our relationships, then we have to be really genuine, really work hard on these 3 fundamental relationships. And really, as a child, you only have 2, the parent-child and the sibling relationship. Now, he hones in on the sibling relationship. He says, siblings are parts of the same physical inheritance and share the same spirit. So just like the tree metaphor before, they're branches of the same tree. But he talks about it in terms of sort of everyday activities and sort of things that we have in common. So in childhood, we're tugging on our parents, similar to our siblings. We eat on the same table, we wear clothes that are handed down, and depending on the age difference between your siblings, you may in fact go to the same school around the same period of time, do similar homework. And so therefore it says, in their walks take the same direction. Now, he's also very realistic, who has not had a fight with their siblings before? But, even if siblings can be quarrelsome, he says they cannot help but love one another, because at the end of the day, you're all going to have to sit around the same table for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So, in that sort of ideal setting, that this is this affection, how this fraternity works. He continues by saying, well, what happens when we grow up? Even though we might have our own families, and even after our parents pass away, siblings should still regard each other with that sort of closeness and intimacy. Usually uses these analogies. And that's because in many ways, we are the only ones, our siblings and us are the only ones who really know about the idiosyncrasies of our family life. What it was like growing up together in this household with our parents in that period of time. So, we share so many things and have so many things in common with our siblings that it's a very, very special relationship. And this is what he mentions, that the relationship between elder and younger siblings differs from our other relationships, even with our best friends. But what happens when it's dysfunctional? What are the causes of our falling out with our siblings? He notes 2 causes here, and this is quite important. I'd like to sort of delve into them a bit more. First is when we expect too much. That causes hatred. The second is close familiarity is also the cause for resentment. So 2 causes here. So what does it mean? First, if we expect too much. Now, this can occur from both parties, the older and the younger siblings. So the older siblings, yes, they are often tasked with instructing and guiding their younger siblings, but they can misuse this authority and sort of order their younger siblings around for things that they don't want to do, housework that they might want to avoid, things that they don't want to be part of. They just rope their younger siblings into it. So that would be expecting too much. You're ordering people around, but you're not actually doing much of the work, and that would obviously cause hatred from your your younger siblings to resent you. But on the other hand, younger siblings can also expect more from their older siblings, and this occurs when the younger sibling shirks their responsibility. So it's quite, it's not easy. It's not difficult to understand this. The younger sibling, obviously, they may have more than one sibling, but on top of that, they have their parents. And if they're tasked to do some sort of housework, they could easily procrastinate, make up some excuses. And then, before long, the older siblings, they can't put up with it anymore, or the parents can't be bothered trying to remind you so many times, so they do it themselves. And so the younger sibling gets out of the work, or they could, pretend to be cute and get out of the work too. So there are, different ways that younger siblings can not pull their weight around the house, even though they're allocated with certain tasks. And of course, that would be then expecting others to do your work, which then causes your siblings to not be quite happy with you. So, this is the very first fault that we can fall into. That we have to be very mindful of when we expect from others. The second also is something that happens often, is when we have this close familiarity. You're around your family members every day, or sometimes 24/7, and you see each other at the best times, at the worst times, at all times really, and you can't really you develop this casualness with them, right? You feel that you don't need to say pleases and thank yous anymore, and that as a result, you can take them for granted. And as they say, familiarity breeds contempt. And it's because of this, when you are over familiar with someone, then you forget to have this healthy respect for them. You forget to appreciate their contributions to the relationship, to the household, and you just take them for granted. Whatever they do, it's expected, or it's not enough, it's not good enough, and therefore that is the source of much resentment as well. Now, speaking from the younger sibling perspective, it's oftentimes the older siblings have to find out things for themselves. And when it comes to the younger sibling, that's sort of that information, that advice is often handed to them on a plate, on a platter. From my own personal experience as a younger sibling, I can say that, when filling out forms for university, or, even tax return forms, things like that, my sister would often help me. And I didn't realize that at that time, when she was filling it out, she would probably ask, 3 or 4 different people, and have to call up the tax office, etc., to confirm things. And when it came to me, she was just sort of this one-stop shop who had all the answers, and this was very convenient, but I didn't realize the work and effort it took to get those answers in the very first place. So you don't realize the groundwork that has already been, all this effort and groundwork that the older sibling has covered. It's sort of like if you were to go to a place, for travel, and you've never been there before, So you sort of have to, scope it out. But if someone else has been there, then they can tell you what to avoid, shortcuts to take, what are really the good tourist sites, etc. And that's sort of like having an older sibling, that they'll tell you everything that so that you don't make the same mistakes. But actually, you don't realize that they made those mistakes on your behalf. And so in many ways, you have to be grateful for that, so that you don't experience that suffering. And even as something as simple as wearing clothes that have been handed down, you don't realize that actually the person who handed down those clothes actually took care of them, so much so that they were still wearable, that you could actually still make use of those clothes. And that in itself is something that we should appreciate and be grateful for. So as a younger sibling, you shouldn't take anything for granted, whether it's the handed down clothes, whether it's that, even one sentence of advice, or, anything from your elder siblings or even other family members. So it's when you don't forget to say thank you, when you don't acknowledge and appreciate them, then this you make the mistake of this close familiarity. Now, a corollary of this close familiarity that often happens with younger siblings is that of carelessness. And this carelessness is quite a common problem because, as I said, it relates to being familiar with someone, that you just think that they'll overlook your faults, that they won't mind, even if the work that you do is sloppy. And so, being the younger siblings, sometimes you feel that, well, maybe someone else will look over my work anyway. And as a result, you pick up these bad habits where you think that, you can get away with anything and just doing the work in a very sloppy way. And you might sometimes feel that, what I do at home is very different from what I do at work, because at work, obviously, I'll take it very seriously, be responsible. But actually, these habits sort of carry over. And in fact, it's not just that the habits carry over and could affect your career, your relationships, not just work, but any other relationship that you have beyond the family. But actually, there's a certain cause and effect that you also have to be wary of. Now, when I've spoken about this idea of fraternity to others before, whether Asians or non-Asians, there is the same. I do get the same sort of feedback. There's a particular story that sticks in my mind, which is, this girl saying that, at home she was the youngest sibling out of three. She never really did much work because, she could often procrastinate, things like mopping. She wouldn't mind if there were clumps of dirt or clumps of dust, because ultimately her eldest sibling was the one who was much more cleaner and couldn't tolerate this, and so would ultimately end up mopping anyway. So it was never really her job, even if she was assigned. She would just wait until someone else couldn't put up with it anymore. Now, that might have been fine when she was living at home, but then when she moved out to in university and later when she was renting, she found that she was the one that had to do all the housework. And this was because she was often her housemates would be the ones who had very high tolerance levels for uncleanliness, and she found herself being the one that couldn't put up with it anymore. How could they not see that this place was so messy, or there were so many hairs on the floor, etc. And she was the one doing all the housework, even though it was actually allocated. So, through that, we could see that what goes around comes around. And this is very much in keeping with what we've learned earlier in the treatise, that, we create the causes. You can't blame your housemates. You just reflect on what you've done for your own family members, the fact that you've done nothing in terms of cleaning for your family members, and therefore you have to do this cleaning now. for others. And it's not that these people are rude or the people that you are shirking their responsibility. It's because you've created those causes and now you have to experience the effects. So this idea of causality, this idea of the law of cause and effect, helps us understand why certain things happen to us. There's no accidents. Even if you sort of interview all your housemates before you live together, you might find that, it's still the case. So this is causality in a nutshell. So, that's really an aside, but that tells us why it's even more important that we have to do the right things and not make these mistakes in the early part of our lives when we're learning, when we're able to, sometimes our family members can tolerate mistakes, but only, if we don't keep repeating them. We have to learn from these mistakes. So 2 things that we have to be mindful of is when we expect too much from others, and when we are so familiar with them that we forget to respect them and to be grateful and appreciate their work. And Yanjutoi continues by saying that, well, yes, take living in a house as an example. When there's a hole, you stop it. When there's a crack, plaster it. And if you are timely in resolving these issues, nip things in the bud, then there's no danger of the house having further damage, get things getting worse. But if you are careless about pests, here sparrows and mice in those days, then what happens is the house gets completely damaged. So what's this analogy? Well, the house is symbolic of the relationship that we have with our siblings. This, it's based on rock solid foundations. What's causing it? If there are certain rifts that we have with our siblings, we try to apologize. We try to sort of think from their perspective and resolve the issues in a timely manner. If we don't do that, then it's like this house that is in danger of being completely ruined. By what and by who? Well, the pests here are representative of outsiders. It could be friends, it could be future girlfriends, boyfriends, partners, spouses, etc. People who might be taking advantage of that situation, who don't know of the relationship that you have developed with your sibling and are trying to drive you apart for their own interests and advantage. So that's why it's so important. And what are the consequences if siblings are not harmonious? Well, it says here that your children, these nephews, cousins, etc., won't be close to each other. And the extended family will become quite distant and cold. And not only that, people in the household will also become hostile towards each other. Now, first of all, you have to think that the consequences are not only in between myself and my siblings, but actually there are flow-on effects. So your children will not have that, very happy environment of, being with this extended family and playing with their cousins. Because, they've heard about all the bad things that their parents have done, etc., and therefore they don't want to come over to be with their cousins. And on top of that, the servants or the employees, etc., will be worried and, stick to their own household. So really, there are consequences for others. And at the very end, it says that even the family members will be despised. Now, how does this work? Well, in those days, these families, these so-called family clans, were actually extended families that lived together in sort of communities. They might not have lived under the same roof, but lived in close proximity. So you'd have people with the same surname in the same branch of the family, the same lineage, living with that sort of one street, that area. And they would look out for each other. The estate, property, etc., would be shared. And and in fact, it was the families that were responsible for looking after widows. If parents had if a child's parents had passed away early in their life, then they would be looked after by their uncles and aunts, and the extended family would take care of the social what we might call social welfare today. So, widowers, orphans, these sorts of sort of the very most vulnerable in the community. The extended family would help out. Now, if the siblings were not harmonious, they all grown up like the Tien family that we talked about before, split everything, go their separate ways, well, who would look after these vulnerable? They would be left out in the communities, and other families, so other members of the family would have to step in. And so that's why these family members who walked away would be despised and even insulted by people from the community, because they weren't able to fulfill their obligations towards the extended family. And why is that? Because of this disharmony between the heads of the family if they were siblings. And so you can see that the consequences were not just between the siblings themselves, but in fact, even the community. And that also reflected very badly on their own family. So this was why harmony within the family was a source of strength. It was something that was cherished. It was something that was taught from a very early age to, look out for each other if you are a sibling, to think about, being friendly and fraternal. So people in the community would be wondering, as it says here, there are those who make friends with anyone in the world, gaining happiness and closeness, but they fail to respect their elder siblings. How is it that they're able to deal with the many, but unable to deal with the few? In other words, they can be friends with heaps of other people, but why not the few siblings that they're born with? They're those who command thousands of soldiers, inspiring in their courage to face death, yet who fail to be kind to their younger siblings. Now, the modern day equivalent of that might be, being the CEO of a very large company with thousands of employees. And yeah, you can manage the company, but what about your relationship with your siblings? How is it that you can get, as it says here, get along well with those who are unrelated, but cannot do so with your own relations? And these are the questions in people's minds that, that's why this sibling sort of relationship is a litmus test for, how it is that you are genuine in your relationships. Why is it that you can't get along with those you're close with, you're related to, but with those who are very, not related by any sort of kinship ties, and also very distant from you. And he goes on to say that, perhaps often the spouses are the cause for these quarrels. But what do you do? What can you do? Well, when these conditions exist, sometimes it's better that the siblings take some time out apart from each other, go somewhere, travel somewhere away. And then it's when you're away from your siblings, when you experience some sort of difficulty on your travels, that you start thinking of the other person and how much you actually depend on them. Because when you're in that environment where you're very supported, as we mentioned before, you can just take people for granted. And when you're outside of that environment, then you think back on how they helped you, how they supported you, and they didn't even, you didn't even thank them. And that's because, most relationships outside of the family, most sort of services outside of the family are transactions. What do I mean by a transaction is that, if if someone does something for us, they're expecting something in return. Might not be immediate, but maybe in the future. And in contrast, you think most of the time, the familial relationships are not about transactions, but about, or should be about, consideration. So your siblings, older or younger, may care for you because they are really concerned, and they're not thinking about how you're going to help them later down the track. This is how the sibling relationship should be characterized. And therefore, that's why Yin Zhi he here recommends that, if you have this kind of rift, maybe you go away and reflect and then think about and realize how much your sibling has actually supported you. He says, it can be difficult when outsiders come in and, you have quarrels and therefore there's this resentment. And why is that the case? Because it may be that your spouses have some sort of selfish interest. They want more of the, in the family share, and they are only thinking about their own private gains. What's the solution? Well, rather than thinking about your own nuclear family, think about the greater extended family. This idea of mutual consideration, to think about the children of others, so your nieces and nephews as if your own, and think about the greater good of the entire family. Think about your parents as the roots of this tree and being branches of the same tree. So this, what I found in these extracts, and this is very much a very large part of the chapter, the main points, is that he sort of discusses the sibling relationship in the context of our lives, from when we're young to when we're older and our parents might pass away, and how we view this relationship and how important it is to cherish it, but also what happens if something goes wrong. Now, what I want to end with in the last few moments is some practical considerations for this virtue of fraternity. Now, here there are 4 sort of ideas. The first is, as a younger sibling, how can you put fraternity into practice? Listen closely to your older sibling. There are many good reasons for this, even though sometimes you might think that they nag. Well, actually, whatever your older sibling says is quite considered. They know you often from, your entire life. They know you inside out, your weaknesses, your strengths. It's sort of like, if you've played with someone for, a tennis partner, and their backhand is better than their forehand, etc. And so their advice is much more tailored compared to if you were to talk to someone outside the family. Sometimes it might be difficult to accept because they're actually giving you honest advice. And that's the advice that you particularly have to listen closely to. The other thing is, of course, that they often have your interests at heart. We're part of the same family. They want you to succeed. And, when I reflect on the advice that my sister has given me throughout my life, I've always benefited. Very simple example is, often she might give me advice on what to wear on certain formal occasions. And, it could be thinking about, what, including the kind of jacket that I might wear on the way home. And I've always benefited because, you see other people freezing and you're the one in the very warm jacket that your sister recommended. And I've always been very grateful. So it's even something as simple as that. The second idea is then to help your older sibling in whatever way you can. Now, as a younger sibling, you might think that you're less skilled, have fewer experiences. It could be that, your older sibling has very high standards. Could be some sort of important task and there's some time pressure. So you don't want to get in the way. And you don't want to be involved because it looks complicated, you don't have the right skill set. But at the same time, it doesn't stop you from offering and sort of thinking about offering your time and any help. Now, it might not even be something that is, very, very difficult. I remember there's one time when I accompanied my sister to the city, to the law library. And at that time, I was thinking about just exploring the city, but I realized that she had a very important deadline. She was sort of photocopying a lot of documents, looking things up on the library, because, couldn't really borrow anything from that law library, the state law library. and then sort of offered to help in some way, and she had me help with looking up some things on the catalogue and then photocopying. And even though I'd never been to that library before and I had no idea what I was actually photocopying, because I don't really have much idea when it comes to legal sort of documents, but actually, based on that experience, now whenever I'm in a library, even if it's a library I've never been to, I'm actually quite confident with using their catalog system, and even some different photocopier machine because of that. So you don't have to. You're actually learning in whatever you do, and oftentimes when you help out your siblings, you learn so much, even basic skills. Even though it's not related to what you're actually studying, but basic skills are actually quite relevant too. So you can always learn, and by helping, you're helping them, but you're actually helping yourself. So never underestimate what you can do to help, and always offer. The third is that idea of a healthy respectfulness that you have to have for everyone in your family, including your older siblings, and to never, ever look down on your older siblings, even if you think that you've achieved more, because most of the time let's face it, when the path that you've taken to achieving achieving that success is often based on the guidance and support of so many people, often even including your older sibling, or teachers, colleagues, etc., other scholars, etc. So whatever you've achieved is actually the result of so many conditions and so many others, and you really can't take credit for all of the work. But at the same time, whatever you have achieved, there's always going to be someone who's better than you. And it's a matter of always knowing your weaknesses, knowing areas that you can improve on, and appreciating the different strengths of others. So let's say, you're really good with the computer and your siblings may not be. They're much slower with the computer. But that doesn't mean you should look down on them, because maybe they're good with other things. And that skill set, the different skill sets within the family are very important, because you actually complement each other. And it's the combination of these different skills that make the family, that make that team that we're talking about. So that as siblings, you're actually part of this incredible team within the family, that you're born with this team, and it's a matter of taking advantage of that, so that you can learn more and do more, do better together. So, I remember when we were younger, we would create our own Christmas cards. I was never really good at designing these cards, and my sister was very good at the art side of things, and I was more interested in writing poetry, and so she would design the card, do the card, and I would write on the inside the message. So you work together and you complement each other, and to have a very happy outcome. And so this idea of the skill set that you can bring together, and people sometimes develop their skills later in life. So as I said, never look down on anyone, especially not your older siblings. But the final one, and I'm sure there's definitely more, but because of the time, just share with you these top four. The fourth one is to share your knowledge with your siblings, whether they're younger or older. And that's because, even if you look at twins, they don't necessarily have the same personality or interests. They often are interested in different things. And as a result, if they do have different careers, study different fields, then by sharing knowledge with each other as siblings, then you actually introduce each other to very different ways of thinking about the world, and seeing the world, understanding the world. And that saves a lot of time. Someone's already learned all of this. They're really sharing with you what they know, how they understand things, and you get this new perspective within the family without, obviously having to pay the fees for the course. And so I remember this when we were learning calligraphy. With my sister and I were learning calligraphy at the same time, and we decided to learn different styles. So obviously, we mentioned the seal script earlier, but there are also different types of scripts that you can learn, and we learned different scripts so that we could then teach each other, and then we wouldn't have to go back and bother the teacher. So in some ways that also saves time and it's more efficient. So this idea of fraternity, I'm sure that those of you who are siblings would come up with a lot more. It's something that you learned your whole life, how to really perfect this. And you learn so much from each other in this relationship. This idea of the family, whether it's the relationship that we have with our parents or our siblings, they're really just this one idea, which is, how we can work better with others. And so the relationships that we have in the family are really the foundation of all our other relationships, whether it's from a social, emotional, cognitive, or even a moral perspective of how we see things. And, this relationship between siblings very much relates to the parent-child relationship. As we mentioned earlier, the filiality or family reverence is so extensive in scope that it's not just within the home, within parent and child, but actually, if you have harmony between siblings, you get along with each other, then your parents will have peace of mind. They know that you look after each other and they don't have to worry. And so that's also part of family reverence or filiality. I'd like to end with this sentence from the classic of family reverence, which sort of ties all of the parts together. So Confucius here says that, when we serve our parents with filiality, family reverence, then it's very easy for us then when we go out into the community, when we have a job, to work well within that career. And as it says here, serve the sovereign, our employee, with loyalty. If we can serve our elder siblings, so get along with them with this idea of fraternity, this respectfulness, this affection, care and consideration, then whenever we meet someone who's older than us, any sort of other person, either older or younger, we can sort of see them as our siblings, and in this case, serve other elders with deference. Within the family, if we're able to manage our affairs, different tasks, housework, etc., then later on in our careers, in this case, in those days, it was a government official position, then, as it says here, they're able to serve with sound administration. In modern terms, this would be, doing well in your work. And therefore, when the conduct is perfected internally, this internally refers to within the family, within the household, then we fully form our characters, all of the virtues, and we're able to have amazing relationships with other people. In all of the different interactions we have with others, we're able to be harmonious, get along, benefit others, etc., contribute to the community. And as a result, we will not only be able to help people in our time, but even leave a legacy for future generations. And that's why it says here that their renown will be established for future generations. So you can see that the impact of having great family relations, getting it right, cultivating this friendliness or fraternity, this filiality is so important, not only for ourselves, all our relationships, but on a much wider level. The greater scope is, to be able to benefit those in the future. So that brings us to the end of this particular explanation of this line, which in the treatise is very simple. It tells us to be faithful, filial, friendly and fraternal, but actually you can see that it covers quite a lot of ground. And if we can do that, then we can really develop ourselves fully, develop our human potential. I'll end there today. Thank you very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.